Sarah Martinez never thought a simple tattoo would change everything. What started as morning coffee with friends turned into a moment that would expose hidden truths, shatter assumptions, and prove that sometimes the most ordinary people carry the most extraordinary secrets. In a world where appearances deceive and first impressions lie, one woman's ink would become the key to unlocking a mystery that had haunted a military unit for years. The coffee shop was buzzing with the usual morning crowd when Sarah rolled up her sleeve to check her watch. That's when they saw it, a small, intricate design that made grown men freeze and a decorated SEAL commander's face turn white with shock. What happened next would remind everyone present that heroes don't always look the way we expect them to, and sometimes the person sitting quietly in the corner has lived through more battles than anyone could imagine. This is the story of how a tattoo revealed the truth about the woman they all thought they knew, and how one mark on her skin would force everyone to confront their own assumptions about courage, service, and the price of keeping secrets. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Coastal Cafe, casting long shadows across the wooden tables where locals gathered for their daily dose of caffeine and conversation. Sarah Martinez sat in her usual corner booth, fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee, her attention focused on the laptop screen before her. At 32, she had the kind of quiet presence that made people comfortable but rarely drew attention. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a modest long-sleeve cardigan over dark jeans, the picture of understated professionalism. To everyone in the small coastal town of Clearwater Bay, Sarah was simply the librarian who had moved there 3 years ago. She kept to herself mostly, lived in a small apartment above the bookstore on Main Street, and could be found most mornings at this very table, working on what people assumed was library business or perhaps writing the novel that every small-town librarian was rumored to be working on. She was polite when spoken to, helpful when asked questions, but maintained the kind of gentle distance that suggested someone who valued privacy above all else. The cafe's atmosphere was punctuated by the familiar sounds of small-town life. Mrs. Henderson was complaining about the new traffic light installation to anyone within earshot, while Tom Bradley, the local mechanic, argued with his brother about the upcoming fishing tournament. The morning regulars had their established routines, their preferred tables, their usual orders. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. Sarah had been coming here long enough to recognize the patterns. She knew that Dr. Williams would arrive at exactly 8:15 and order a double espresso with a blueberry muffin, that the Murphy twins would rush in at 8:30 grabbing coffee and donuts before school, and that by 9 o'clock, the breakfast rush would settle into the quieter rhythm of retirees and part-time workers enjoying a leisurely start to their day. This predictability was part of what had drawn her to Clearwater Bay in the first place. After years of chaos and uncertainty, the simple pleasure of knowing what each day would bring felt like a luxury she had never experienced before. But this Tuesday morning would be different, though Sarah had no way of knowing it as she clicked through her emails and sipped her coffee. She was dressed as she always was, in clothing that covered her arms completely, her long sleeves a habit so ingrained that she barely thought about it anymore. The cardigan was soft navy blue, comfortable and professional, perfect for her role at the library where she helped elderly patrons find large print mysteries and assisted college students with research projects. The bell above the cafe door chimed, and Sarah glanced up briefly to see a group of men entering. They moved with a particular kind of awareness, their eyes automatically scanning the room before they chose their seats. Even in civilian clothes, there was something about the way they carried themselves that suggested military training. This wasn't unusual in Clearwater Bay, which was home to a small naval installation about 20 miles north. Military personnel, both active duty and retired, were common in the area, and Sarah had grown accustomed to their presence without giving it much thought. The group settled at a large table near the center of the cafe, their conversation a low murmur of camaraderie and shared experiences. Sarah returned her attention to her laptop, where she was updating the library's catalog system, a task that required enough concentration to tune out the surrounding conversations. She had always been good at making herself invisible, at blending into the background in a way that allowed others to forget she was there. It was a skill she had learned out of necessity, refined over years of practice, and it served her well in her quiet new life. The temperature in the cafe was warm, heated by both the morning sun and the espresso machine that hissed and steamed behind the counter. Sarah felt a slight flush of warmth and, without thinking, pushed up the sleeves of her cardigan to her elbows. It was such a natural, unconscious gesture that she didn't notice the immediate silence that fell over the table of military men, didn't see the way one of them went completely still, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. Commander Jake Sullivan had been in the middle of telling a story about their last training exercise when movement caught his peripheral vision. He turned slightly and found himself staring at the woman in the corner booth, specifically at her exposed forearm. For a moment, his brain struggled to process what he was seeing, because what he was seeing should have been impossible. There, etched in black ink on the pale skin of Sarah's left forearm, was a tattoo that Jake Sullivan recognized immediately. It was small, no larger than a quarter, but the design was unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. A trident intertwined with an anchor, surrounded by 13 stars, with a single red rose at the base. To most people, it would look like nothing more than a pretty nautical design, perhaps chosen by someone who loved the ocean or had a romantic notion about naval life. But, to Jake Sullivan, that tattoo told a very different story. Jake knew that tattoo because it wasn't supposed to exist. It was the mark of Unit Shadow 7, a classified special operations team that had been disbanded 4 years ago after a mission that officially never happened. Only 12 people in the world were authorized to carry that mark, and Jake knew the location and status of 11 of them. The 12th person, according to all official records, was dead. Sarah Martinez, the quiet librarian who read mystery novels and helped senior citizens navigate the internet, was wearing the tattoo of a ghost. Jake's teammates noticed his sudden stillness and followed his gaze to the woman in the corner. Lieutenant Marcus Chen, a demolitions expert with an eye for detail, squinted at Sarah's arm and felt his own breath catch. Sergeant Tony Reeves, their communications specialist, slowly set down his coffee cup with the careful precision of someone trying not to make a sound. The fourth member of their group, Petty Officer David Kim, leaned forward slightly to get a better look, and Jake saw the exact moment when recognition dawned in his eyes. None of them spoke. They couldn't, not in a public place, not about something that was supposed to be buried so deep that even thinking about it required security clearance. But they all knew what they were seeing, and they all understood the impossibility of it. Unit Shadow 7 had been more than classified, it had been black ops of the blackest kind, the sort of operation that existed in the spaces between official acknowledgments, funded by money that didn't appear in any budget, staffed by people who technically didn't exist while they served. Sarah, completely unaware of the scrutiny, continued typing on her laptop. She was working on the summer reading program, trying to coordinate with local schools to encourage students to maintain their reading habits during vacation. It was exactly the kind of wholesome, community-minded work that people expected from their librarian, the sort of task that reinforced every assumption about who she was and what her life had been like before she came to Clearwater Bay. The irony wasn't lost on her, though she was the only one in the room who could appreciate it. Here she was, planning programs to encourage young people to read about adventures and heroes, when she herself had lived through experiences that would make the most thrilling novels seem tame by comparison. But those experiences belonged to someone else, to a life she had left behind so completely that sometimes she could almost believe it had happened to someone else entirely. Jake Sullivan was facing a dilemma that his training had never prepared him for. Everything he knew about military protocol, about operational security, about the chain of command, told him that he needed to report this immediately to his superiors. The appearance of someone who was supposed to be dead, especially someone who had been part of such a highly classified operation, was the sort of security breach that could end careers and compromise ongoing operations. But something about the way Sarah sat there, so completely ordinary and peaceful, made him hesitate. She looked up at that moment, perhaps sensing the weight of their stares, and her eyes met Jake's across the cafe. For just an instant, he saw something flicker in her expression, a wariness that seemed disproportionate to the situation. It was there and gone so quickly that he almost missed it, but he had been trained to notice such things, to read the micro-expressions that revealed hidden truths. In that brief moment of eye contact, Jake Sullivan realized that Sarah Martinez knew exactly who they were and what they had seen. The moment passed, and Sarah's expression returned to the mild curiosity of a stranger wondering why she was being stared at. She offered a polite smile, the sort that locals give to newcomers, and returned her attention to her laptop. But Jake had seen enough. The woman in the corner booth was not who she appeared to be, and the tattoo on her arm was either evidence of the most impossible coincidence in military history or proof that someone who was supposed to be dead was very much alive and working as a small-town librarian. The bell above the door chimed again as new customers entered, breaking the spell that had fallen over Jake's table. His teammates were looking to him for guidance, their expressions carefully neutral but their body language tense with questions they couldn't ask in public. Jake made a subtle hand gesture, a signal that meant stand down and maintain cover, and watched as his men reluctantly returned their attention to their breakfast. But Jake couldn't stop looking at Sarah Martinez. Every detail about her seemed to take on new significance now that he knew what that tattoo meant. The way she sat with her back to the wall and a clear view of the door. The fact that she had chosen a table in the corner where she couldn't be approached from behind. The subtle way she had positioned her laptop so that the screen wasn't visible to anyone else in the cafe. These weren't the habits of a librarian, they were the habits of someone who had been trained to always maintain situational awareness, to never leave herself vulnerable to surprise. As the morning progressed and the cafe began to empty of its breakfast crowd, Jake found himself trapped between duty and curiosity. Protocol demanded that he report the sighting immediately, but something deeper, perhaps the soldier's instinct for recognizing one of his own, made him want to understand how Sarah Martinez had gone from being a member of one of the most elite and secretive units in the military to stamping due dates in library books. Sarah, for her part, finished her work and packed up her laptop with the same unhurried efficiency she displayed every morning. She pulled her sleeves back down, covering the tattoo that had caused such a stir, and gathered her things. As she prepared to leave, she glanced once more in Jake's direction, and this time there was no mistaking the message in her eyes. She knew that he knew, and she was warning him not to pursue it. But Jake Sullivan had not achieved his rank by backing down from difficult situations, and the mystery of Sarah Martinez was about to become the most important mission of his career. As she walked past their table on her way to the door, he made a decision that would change everything for both of them. He stood up, his movement casual but deliberate, and stepped into her path. The confrontation that would shatter the careful life Sarah had built was about to begin, and neither of them was prepared for how deep the truth would cut when it finally came to light. The collision was gentle but deliberate. Jake Sullivan timed his movement perfectly, rising from his chair just as Sarah Martinez reached his table, creating what would appear to anyone watching as an accidental encounter. His coffee cup tipped slightly, spilling a few drops onto the table, giving him the excuse he needed to apologize and create a moment of conversation. "Oh, excuse me," Jake said, his voice carrying the practiced casualness of someone accustomed to making split-second decisions look effortless. "I didn't see you there. Let me get some napkins for this mess." Sarah paused, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder, and Jake saw that flicker of wariness again, more pronounced this time. She was evaluating the situation, weighing options in a way that confirmed everything he suspected about her true nature. Her response, when it came, was perfectly calibrated to maintain her cover. "No harm done," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "These things happen." But, as Jake reached across the table for napkins, he deliberately positioned himself so that only she could see his face clearly. In a voice barely above a whisper, pitched so low that even his teammates at the same table couldn't hear, he said 4 words that he knew would shatter her carefully constructed world: Phantom 6, requesting confirmation. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Sarah's entire body went rigid for a fraction of a second before her training kicked in and she forced herself to remain outwardly calm. Phantom 6 had been her call sign during her time with Unit Shadow 7, a designation known only to her commanding officers and her immediate team members. The fact that Jake Sullivan knew it meant that he wasn't just some random Navy SEAL who had happened to recognize her tattoo. He was someone with access to information that was supposed to be buried so deep that it would never see daylight again. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the chaos Jake could see building behind her eyes. "I think you have me confused with someone else. I'm just the town librarian." Jake straightened up, dabbing at the spilled coffee with obvious theatrical concern while his teammates watched the interaction with growing confusion. To them, it looked like their commander was making unnecessarily elaborate apologies to a local woman over a minor accident. They couldn't hear the conversation, couldn't see the way Sarah's hands had unconsciously shifted into a defensive posture, couldn't detect the subtle change in her breathing that indicated someone preparing for potential conflict. "Of course," Jake said, loud enough for his men to hear. "How clumsy of me. I hope I didn't delay you." Then, dropping his voice again, he added, "Lighthouse Cafe, 3 blocks north, 1 hour. Come alone, or I make the call to Quantico that will end your new life permanently." Sarah nodded politely, as if he had simply apologized for the near collision, and continued toward the door. Her pace was measured, unhurried, giving no indication of the internal storm that Jake's words had unleashed. But he noticed that she didn't look back, didn't glance over her shoulder as she might have if this had been a truly casual encounter. She walked like someone who knew she was being watched and refused to give her observers any additional information about her state of mind. As the cafe door closed behind her, Jake returned to his seat to find 3 pairs of eyes fixed on him with varying degrees of confusion and suspicion. Lieutenant Chen was the first to speak, his voice carefully neutral but loaded with subtext. "Interesting interaction, Commander. Did you know our librarian had such an extensive knowledge of coffee shop etiquette?" "She seemed very composed," added Sergeant Reeves, who had been watching the entire exchange with the trained eye of someone accustomed to reading people for signs of deception or hidden agendas. Jake Sullivan found himself in the uncomfortable position of having information that he couldn't share with his own team, at least not yet. The existence of Unit Shadow 7 was classified at a level that required specific clearance and need-to-know authorization. Even among Special Operations personnel, there were secrets within secrets, operations so black that acknowledging their existence to the wrong person could constitute treason. "Just being friendly," Jake said, knowing that his men would recognize the deflection for what it was. "We're visitors in their town. Public relations matter." Petty Officer Kim leaned back in his chair, studying Jake's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. "That was some pretty sophisticated public relations, sir. Almost looked like you knew each other." The observation was too close to the truth for comfort, and Jake realized that his team's training was working against him. They had been taught to notice discrepancies, to question inconsistencies, to probe for hidden information. The very skills that made them excellent special operators were now focused on their commanding officer, and Jake could see that his deflections weren't going to satisfy them for much longer. "What I know," Jake said with the tone of authority that indicated the conversation was over, "is that we have training exercises to prepare for and reports to file. Whatever theories you're developing about the local population can wait until after we've completed our actual mission." It was a masterful redirection, reminding his men of their official reason for being in Clearwater Bay while simultaneously establishing that further questions about Sarah Martinez were off limits. But Jake could see that he had only bought himself temporary respite. His team was too smart and too experienced to let this go completely. The next hour passed with excruciating slowness. Jake went through the motions of discussing their upcoming training schedule, reviewing equipment lists, and planning their next phase of operations, but his mind was entirely focused on the meeting he had demanded with Sarah Martinez. He found himself wondering how she would handle the confrontation, whether she would attempt to deny everything or try to disappear rather than face whatever consequences his knowledge might bring. What Jake didn't know was that Sarah had spent the hour since leaving the cafe making her own preparations. She had returned to her apartment, ostensibly to drop off her laptop and change clothes before heading to the library for her afternoon shift. But, instead of changing into her usual work attire, she had opened a closet that appeared to contain nothing but modest cardigan sweaters and conservative dresses. Behind the false back panel, however, was a collection of items that told a very different story about the woman who lived there. The go bag was compact but comprehensive, containing documents, cash, and communication equipment that would allow her to disappear completely within hours if necessary. She had hoped never to need it, had convinced herself over the past 3 years that the life she had built in Clearwater Bay was permanent and secure. But Sarah Martinez had not survived as long as she had by being unprepared for the possibility that her past might catch up with her. As she made her way to the Lighthouse Cafe, Sarah reflected on the bitter irony of her situation. She had chosen Clearwater Bay specifically because of its proximity to the naval installation, reasoning that a town accustomed to military personnel would be less likely to ask probing questions about a newcomer's background. military families moved frequently, and civilians who worked with the military often had gaps in their employment history that were perfectly explainable. She had thought herself clever for hiding in plain sight, for choosing a cover identity that would make her invisible in a community where questions about the past were considered impolite. Instead, she had unknowingly positioned herself in the exact place where someone with knowledge of her real identity would be most likely to find her. The Lighthouse Cafe was smaller and quieter than Coastal Cafe, the sort of place that catered to locals looking for a peaceful spot to read or work on their laptops. Sarah arrived 5 minutes early, automatically choosing a table that gave her clear sightlines to all entrances and exits. It was a habit so ingrained that she didn't even realize she was doing it, but Jake Sullivan noticed it immediately when he walked through the door precisely on time. He had come alone, as she had demanded, though Sarah suspected that his team was positioned somewhere nearby, ready to provide backup if the situation went wrong. Jake moved with the controlled confidence of someone accustomed to dangerous situations, but there was something in his posture that suggested he viewed this meeting as potentially more hazardous than anything he had faced in traditional combat. "Thank you for coming," Jake said as he took the seat across from her. "Though I suppose I should say thank you for not disappearing instead." Sarah studied his face, noting the weathered lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent in harsh conditions, the small scar on his temple that suggested close-quarters combat experience, the way he positioned himself to maintain awareness of his surroundings. He was clearly a career military officer, someone who had earned his position through competence and dedication rather than politics or connections. "Disappearing would have confirmed everything you suspect," Sarah replied. "Besides, I'm curious about how much you actually know and how you came to know it." Jake appreciated her directness. In his experience, people with something to hide usually began such conversations with denials and misdirection. Sarah's willingness to acknowledge that there was indeed something to discuss suggested a level of confidence that was either admirable or terrifying. "I know that you're wearing the tattoo of Unit Shadow 7, Jake said, deciding that honesty was the best approach. "I know that unit was officially disbanded 4 years ago after a mission in Eastern Europe that resulted in multiple casualties. I know that according to all official records, the team member designated Phantom 6 was killed in action and her body never recovered." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but Jake caught a slight tightening around her eyes at the mention of casualties. It was a minute reaction, but it told him that whatever had happened during that mission in Eastern Europe, it still affected her deeply. "That's quite a lot of classified information to be sharing in a coffee shop," Sarah observed. "Either you're very confident in your security clearance, or you're taking enormous risks with your career." "Both," Jake admitted. But seeing a dead woman working as a librarian seemed like the kind of anomaly that required immediate investigation. For the first time since they had sat down, Sarah smiled, and Jake was surprised by how the expression transformed her face. The careful neutrality that seemed to be her default expression gave way to something that was both sad and amused, the look of someone who had been living with a burden for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to share it. "Dead," she repeated, as if testing the word. "Yes, I suppose that's the official version. Though I have to say, being dead has been remarkably similar to being alive, just with better job security and fewer people shooting at me." The casual way she mentioned being shot at confirmed everything Jake had suspected about her background, but it also raised new questions. If Sarah Martinez was indeed the operative known as Phantom 6, then her survival of what was supposed to be a fatal mission represented either an intelligence failure of massive proportions or something much more complicated and potentially dangerous. "Why don't you tell me what really happened in Prague?" Jake said, using the location of Shadow 7's final mission to test whether Sarah's knowledge matched what was in the classified files. "Because the official report raises more questions than it answers." Sarah's smile faded, and Jake saw her retreat behind the careful mask that she wore for the world. But there was something else in her expression now, something that looked like relief mixed with resignation. After 3 years of carrying the truth alone, she was finally going to tell someone what had really happened in that warehouse in Prague, and why the woman known as Phantom 6 had to die so that Sarah Martinez could live. The conversation that would follow would force both of them to confront truths about loyalty, betrayal, and the price of serving one's country that neither was fully prepared to handle. But there was no turning back now. The careful life that Sarah had built was already crumbling, and the only question was whether the truth would set them both free or destroy them completely. Sarah Martinez stared into her coffee cup for a long moment, watching the steam rise and dissipate in the afternoon air. When she finally looked up at Jake Sullivan, her expression had changed completely. Gone was the careful neutrality of the librarian, replaced by something harder, more dangerous, and infinitely more real. It was as if she had finally stopped pretending and allowed her true self to surface. "Prague," she said quietly. "You know, there are nights when I still wake up thinking I can smell that warehouse burning. 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days, and I still dream about the sound of those bullets hitting concrete." Jake leaned forward slightly, recognizing the shift in her demeanor. This was no longer a conversation between a SEAL commander and a small-town librarian. This was one operator talking to another, sharing the kind of truth that could only exist between people who had lived through combat and understood its lasting costs. "The official report says that Shadow 7 was compromised during an extraction operation," Jake said carefully. "That enemy forces surrounded your position and that Phantom 6 provided covering fire while the rest of the team evacuated. It says she was presumed killed when the building collapsed from explosive damage." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "The official report says a lot of things. Most of them are lies designed to protect people who were never in any danger themselves. The truth is considerably more complicated and significantly more ugly." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. Jake realized that whatever she was about to tell him would likely be information that could get them both killed if it reached the wrong ears. The weight of that responsibility settled over him like a heavy cloak, but his need to understand what had happened overrode his concerns about the consequences. "We weren't in Prague for an extraction," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were there to retrieve intelligence about a weapons trafficking network that was selling American military technology to the highest bidders. The mission was supposed to be simple: get in, download the files, get out. Clean and quiet, no confrontations, no complications." Jake nodded, recognizing the type of operation she was describing. Shadow 7 had been designed for exactly that sort of mission: highly classified intelligence gathering that required surgical precision and absolute deniability. The fact that it had gone wrong suggested either poor planning or a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation on the ground. "The intelligence was good," Sarah said, anticipating his question. "The warehouse contained exactly what we expected to find: a computer network with detailed records of sales, client lists, and shipping manifests that would have exposed dozens of high-level conspirators. The problem wasn't with our information. The problem was that someone had told the targets we were coming." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as the implications became clear. A compromised mission was bad enough, but a deliberately sabotaged operation suggested corruption at the highest levels of the military hierarchy. "You're talking about betrayal," Jake said, not quite making it a question. "I'm talking about treason," Sarah corrected him. "Someone with access to our mission briefings, someone who knew our exact timeline and approach route, sold us out to the very people we were investigating. We walked into that warehouse thinking we were conducting a covert operation, but we were actually being served up as sacrificial lambs." She took a sip of her coffee, and Jake noticed that her hands were perfectly steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. Whatever trauma Sarah Martinez carried from that night in Prague, she had learned to function with it rather than being paralyzed by it. "The attack came exactly 37 minutes after we entered the building," she continued. "Not random timing. They waited until they knew we would have accessed the computers, until they knew we would have seen at least some of the files we were there to retrieve. They wanted us to understand what we had stumbled into before they killed us." Jake found himself thinking about his own team, about the trust that existed between operators who depended on each other for survival. The idea that such trust could be weaponized against them was almost unthinkable, but he knew that Sarah wasn't lying. The pain in her voice was too real, too specific to be fabricated. "What did you find in those files?" he asked. Sarah's expression became even grimmer. "Names, dates, transaction records going back 3 years. American military technology, communications equipment, body armor, weapons systems, being sold to terrorist organizations, foreign governments, criminal syndicates." But the real shock was the client list. We weren't looking at some rogue operation run by a few corrupt contractors. We were looking at an organized network that included active duty military officers, Defense Department officials, and at least 2 sitting members of Congress. The scope of what she was describing was staggering. Jake had always known that corruption existed within the military-industrial complex, but the scale of the operation Sarah was describing suggested something far more systematic and dangerous than isolated incidents of individual greed. The people shooting at us weren't random criminals, Sarah said. They were a professional team, military-trained, using American weapons and tactical equipment. They knew our positions, our likely escape routes, our standard operational procedures. They had been briefed on everything except one crucial detail. Which was? They didn't know about the emergency protocols that Shadow 7 had developed for exactly this type of scenario. Every member of our unit carried specialized communication equipment that could create a burst transmission containing all the data we had collected. If we were compromised, if the mission was blown, we were authorized to transmit everything we had found directly to a secure server at Quantico. Jake began to understand where the story was leading. You transmitted the files. I transmitted everything, Sarah confirmed. Every name, every transaction, every piece of evidence that showed how American military technology was being used to kill American soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq. It was the largest intelligence coup in the history of the unit, and it painted targets on everyone whose name appeared in those files. She paused again, and Jake saw her struggling with memories that were clearly still painful. When she continued, her voice was even quieter than before. The problem was that the transmission took 12 minutes to complete. 12 minutes during which I had to maintain my position in that warehouse while my teammates fought to keep the enemy from reaching me. 12 minutes while the building burned around us and people I cared about died to protect information that would expose traitors in our own government. The mathematics of the situation were brutal. In special operations, 12 minutes was an eternity, especially when facing a determined and well-equipped enemy force. The fact that Sarah had survived long enough to complete the transmission spoke to both her own skills and the sacrifice of her teammates. The official report says that all of Shadow 7 was killed in the warehouse collapse, Jake said. The official report is partially true, Sarah replied. 4 members of Shadow 7 were killed in Prague that night. 2 during the firefight, 1 when the first explosives detonated, and 1 from smoke inhalation when the upper floors collapsed. But 2 of us made it out alive. Jake felt his breath catch. The implications of what she was saying were staggering. If 2 members of Shadow 7 had survived, why was there no record of it? Why had they been declared dead along with their teammates? My team leader, Captain David Chen, no relation to your Lieutenant Chen, by the way, made the decision that saved both our lives and probably prevented a war within our own military structure. He realized that the people who had betrayed us would never stop hunting us as long as we posed a threat to their operation. The only way we could survive was to officially die. The logistics of faking their own deaths within the military system would have been incredibly complex, requiring cooperation from multiple levels of command and intelligence agencies. But Jake was beginning to understand that the betrayal Sarah was describing would have created exactly the sort of crisis that might justify such extreme measures. Captain Chen had contacts in military intelligence who were investigating the weapons trafficking network from a different angle, Sarah explained. People who had suspected that American technology was being diverted but hadn't been able to prove it. When they received our transmission, when they realized the scope of what we had uncovered, they made a decision to protect their sources by declaring us dead and giving us new identities. And you've been living as Sarah Martinez ever since. For 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days, she confirmed. Learning to be a librarian, learning to care about summer reading programs and book fairs and whether the biography section needs reorganizing. Learning to be normal. Jake studied her face, trying to imagine the transition from elite special operations soldier to small-town librarian. The psychological adjustment alone would have been staggering, never mind the practical challenges of creating and maintaining an entirely new identity. What happened to Captain Chen? He asked. For the first time since she had begun telling her story, Sarah's composure cracked slightly. Jake saw grief flash across her features, quickly suppressed but unmistakably real. David didn't adapt as well as I did to civilian life, she said quietly. He tried, but the isolation, the constant vigilance, the knowledge that we could never contact our families again, it broke something in him. He started drinking, started taking risks, started acting in ways that drew attention. 2 years ago, he was killed in what was officially a drunk driving accident in Montana. The words carried implications that Jake didn't want to examine too closely. The death of someone with knowledge as dangerous as Captain Chen's would never be truly accidental, regardless of what the official reports might claim. I'm the only one left, Sarah said, and Jake heard the weight of that truth in her voice. The only person still alive who witnessed what happened in Prague, who knows the names of the people responsible for killing American soldiers for profit. And, now you know too. Jake realized that the conversation had reached a turning point. Sarah Martinez had just entrusted him with information that could get them both killed, information that powerful people had already murdered to protect. The question now was what he intended to do with that knowledge, and his answer would determine whether Sarah's carefully constructed new life could continue or whether she would have to disappear again, leaving behind the peace she had fought so hard to find. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade outside the coffee shop windows, and Jake could see his own reflection in the glass, distorted and uncertain. In a few hours, he would need to decide whether to file a report that would destroy the woman sitting across from him or become complicit in a cover-up that protected traitors but preserved the life of someone who had already sacrificed everything for her country. Neither choice felt like justice, but Jake was beginning to understand that in the world Sarah Martinez had inhabited, justice was often a luxury that no one could afford. Jake Sullivan sat in silence for several minutes after Sarah finished her story, his mind racing through the implications of everything she had told him. Outside the coffee shop windows, the normal rhythms of small-town life continued unabated. People walked their dogs, children rode bicycles on the sidewalks, elderly couples strolled hand-in-hand toward the pier. The contrast between the peaceful scene outside and the dark revelations Sarah had shared created a surreal sense of disconnection from reality. The intelligence you transmitted, Jake said finally. What happened to it? If you exposed a network that extensive, there should have been arrests, prosecutions, congressional hearings. Sarah's expression was bitter. There were. Quietly. Very quietly. Over the course of 18 months following Prague, 17 people were arrested on various charges. Defense contractors lost their security clearances and their government contracts. 3 military officers were court-martialed and imprisoned. 2 congressmen chose not to run for re-election and retired from public life with surprising speed. She paused, stirring her coffee absently. But the prosecutions were carefully managed to avoid any public acknowledgement of how the information was obtained. The official story was that routine audits and internal investigations had uncovered evidence of corruption. No mention of Shadow 7, no mention of Prague, no mention of the soldiers who died to expose the truth. Jake felt a familiar anger building in his chest. He had seen this pattern before, the way inconvenient truths were buried beneath layers of classification and bureaucratic maneuvering, the way heroic actions were erased from history to protect political interests. But he had never before encountered a situation where the cover-up was so complete that it included faking the deaths of the people who had made the ultimate sacrifice. So you've been watching from the sidelines while other people took credit for your work, he said. I've been alive, Sarah corrected him. Which is more than I expected when I was crouched behind a concrete barrier in that warehouse, listening to automatic weapons fire getting closer while my laptop finished uploading terabytes of classified documents. Being anonymous was the price of breathing, and I decided it was a price worth paying. Jake understood the logic of her choice, but he also recognized the cost. Sarah Martinez had given up everything that defined her identity, her career, her family, her friends, her sense of purpose, to preserve information that had ultimately saved lives by exposing a network of traitors. The fact that she had managed to build any kind of meaningful existence in Clearwater Bay was a testament to her resilience, but he could see the isolation in her eyes, the way she held herself apart from genuine connection with others. The people you're protecting, Jake said carefully, the ones who gave you this new identity. Do they still maintain contact with you? Sarah shook her head. Radio silence. Complete separation was part of the deal. They couldn't protect me if they maintained any connection to me, and I couldn't compromise their investigation by trying to stay in touch. For all practical purposes, Sarah Martinez exists in a vacuum, with no past and no future beyond what she creates for herself. The implications were staggering. Not only was Sarah living under an assumed identity, but she was doing so without any support network, any backup plan, any safety net beyond her own skills and resources. The courage required to maintain such an existence for over 3 years was almost incomprehensible to Jake, who had always operated within the framework of military structure and support. "Why are you telling me all of this?" Jake asked. "You could have denied everything, maintained your cover, waited for me to go away. Instead, you're trusting me with information that could destroy your entire life." Sarah looked at him with an expression that was both calculating and resigned. "Because you already knew enough to destroy my life anyway. Because I recognized something in your face when you saw my tattoo, something that told me you're not the kind of person who would use this information carelessly. And because after 3 years of complete isolation, the chance to tell someone the truth felt worth the risk." Jake felt the weight of her trust settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Sarah Martinez had just placed her life in his hands, betting everything on her ability to read his character in a few moments of observation. The responsibility was both flattering and terrifying. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice dropping even lower. "Something I haven't told you yet, something that changes the whole situation." Jake felt his pulse quicken. Throughout their conversation, he had sensed that Sarah was holding something back, some crucial piece of information that she was hesitant to reveal. The fact that she was finally ready to share it suggested that they had crossed some invisible threshold of trust. "The weapons trafficking network we exposed in Prague," Sarah continued. "It wasn't completely shut down. The arrests and prosecutions eliminated the American side of the operation, but the foreign connections, the international suppliers, the overseas distribution networks, they're still active. And they're still using American technology, just obtaining it through different channels." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. If Sarah was correct, then the mission in Prague had been only partially successful. The immediate threat to American forces had been reduced, but the underlying problem continued to exist, potentially putting current military operations at risk. "How do you know this?" Jake asked. Sarah reached into her purse and withdrew a smartphone, but instead of the simple device Jake might have expected a librarian to carry, this was clearly a sophisticated piece of communication equipment, encrypted and modified in ways that suggested ongoing intelligence work. "Because I've been monitoring the situation," Sarah said quietly. "Not actively investigating, not taking risks, just watching. Keeping track of patterns, following money trails that are visible in public records, maintaining awareness of potential threats. It's become a habit, a compulsion I can't seem to break." She activated the phone and showed Jake a series of files that contained shipping records, financial transactions, and photographic evidence that painted a disturbing picture. American military equipment was still appearing in conflict zones around the world, still being used against American forces, still generating profits for people who viewed national security as a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. The network adapted, Sarah explained. They created new shell companies, established different supply chains, recruited new personnel to replace the ones who were arrested. They learned from Prague, became more careful, more sophisticated. And now they're bigger than ever. Jake stared at the evidence Sarah was showing him, feeling a growing sense of urgency. If her information was accurate, then there was an ongoing threat to American military personnel that was being ignored or overlooked by the very people whose job it was to prevent such situations. "Why haven't you reported this to the authorities?" he asked. Sarah's laugh was harsh. "To whom? The same system that betrayed Shadow 7 in the first place? The same bureaucracy that decided the best way to handle the Prague incident was to bury it so deep that it effectively never happened? I'm officially dead, remember. Dead people don't file intelligence reports." Jake began to understand the impossible situation Sarah found herself in. She possessed information that could save American lives, but she had no legitimate way to share that information without exposing herself and potentially compromising the investigation that had given her a new identity. She was trapped between her duty as a soldier and her need to remain hidden. "But now you're here," Sarah said, studying Jake's face with the intensity of someone making a crucial decision. A serving officer with security clearance and access to command structure. Someone who could take this information and act on it through proper channels. The request hit Jake like a revelation. Sarah wasn't just sharing her story with him, she was offering him a mission. She was asking him to become the conduit through which her continued intelligence work could reach the people who could act on it. It was an elegant solution to an impossible problem, but it was also incredibly dangerous for both of them. "You're asking me to become complicit in your cover-up," Jake said. "I'm asking you to help me finish the job we started in Prague," Sarah corrected. "I'm asking you to make sure that the people who died in that warehouse didn't sacrifice their lives for nothing. I'm asking you to help me protect American soldiers who are currently at risk because our own technology is being used against them." Jake felt the familiar pull of duty warring with concerns about protocol and regulation. Everything Sarah was asking him to do violated multiple military regulations and, probably, several federal laws. But everything she was asking him to do was also clearly the right thing to do from a moral and strategic perspective. "My team," Jake said slowly. "They know something happened during our encounter this morning. They're not going to stop asking questions." Sarah nodded. "I've been thinking about that. Your team consists of highly trained special operations personnel with security clearances and combat experience. They're exactly the kind of people who might be useful for the type of work I'm talking about." The suggestion was so audacious that Jake almost laughed. Sarah was proposing that he not only become involved in her unauthorized intelligence operation but that he recruit his entire team to join them. The risks were astronomical, but Jake had to admit that the potential benefits were equally significant. "You're talking about operating completely outside the chain of command," Jake said. "I'm talking about operating where the chain of command has failed," Sarah replied. "I'm talking about doing what special operations personnel are trained to do: improvise, adapt, and overcome obstacles that conventional military structure can't handle." Jake looked out the window again, watching the peaceful streets of Clearwater Bay and thinking about American soldiers serving in combat zones around the world. Some of them were probably facing threats at this very moment from weapons that had been sold by traders who valued profit more than patriotism. The thought of those soldiers dying while he sat in a coffee shop debating protocol and procedure was almost unbearable. "If I agree to this," Jake said finally, "if I help you continue your work, what exactly are we talking about? What would be the scope of the operation?" Sarah's expression became more animated than he had seen since their conversation began. "Intelligence gathering, primarily. Monitoring the financial networks, tracking shipments, identifying new players in the trafficking network. Most of it can be done remotely, through computer analysis and careful observation. But, occasionally, there might be opportunities for more direct action." The phrase direct action carried specific meaning in military terminology, and Jake understood that Sarah was suggesting the possibility of actual operations designed to disrupt the weapons trafficking network. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying, offering the chance to make a real difference while creating enormous personal and professional risks. As the afternoon shadows lengthened outside the coffee shop, Jake Sullivan found himself facing a decision that would define the rest of his military career and, possibly, his entire life. He could walk away, file a routine report about his encounter with Sarah Martinez, and return to the conventional world of authorized missions and official oversight. Or he could step into the shadows with a woman who had already sacrificed everything for her country and help her continue a fight that the system had abandoned. The choice should have been obvious, but Jake had learned that the most important decisions in life were rarely the easiest ones to make. 3 weeks after the encounter at the coffee shop, Commander Jake Sullivan stood in the basement of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Clearwater Bay, watching Sarah Martinez brief his team on an intelligence operation that officially didn't exist. The transformation in her demeanor was remarkable. Gone was the quiet librarian who had stamped due dates and organized reading programs, replaced by a confident operator who commanded attention and respect through sheer competence and knowledge. "The target is a shipping facility in Norfolk," Sarah was saying, pointing to satellite photographs displayed on multiple computer screens that she had somehow acquired and set up in their improvised command center. Intelligence indicates that this is where the trafficking network consolidates American military technology before shipping it overseas. The facility is legitimate on paper, they handle commercial cargo for a dozen different companies, but our analysis shows patterns that suggest they're also processing unauthorized shipments. Lieutenant Chen leaned forward to study the images more closely. Over the past 3 weeks, Jake's team had gradually been brought into Sarah's operation, each man making his own decision to cross the line from authorized military service to something that existed in the gray areas between legal and necessary. The transition had not been easy for any of them, but the evidence Sarah had shown them of ongoing threats to American personnel had ultimately convinced them all that action was required. Security? Asked Sergeant Reeves, his communications expertise making him naturally concerned about the electronic surveillance capabilities they would face during any reconnaissance mission. Sarah switched to a different set of images showing the facility's perimeter and internal layout. Standard commercial security. Cameras, motion sensors, basic alarm systems. Nothing that should challenge people with your training. The real problem isn't getting in and out, it's knowing what to look for once we're inside. She pulled up a series of shipping manifests and customs documents that looked completely legitimate to anyone without specialized knowledge. The trafficking network has become very sophisticated about hiding their activities within normal commercial operations. They're not shipping weapons anymore, they're shipping components, parts, and technology that can be assembled into weapons systems after delivery. A circuit board here, a targeting system there, communications equipment disguised as commercial electronics. Petty Officer Kim studied the documents with the careful attention of someone trained to spot deception and misdirection. How do we identify the illegal shipments among all the legitimate cargo? Sarah's smile was sharp and predatory. That's where my 3 years of watching and waiting finally pay off. I've been tracking the financial flows, identifying shell companies, mapping the relationships between various players in the network. I know which manifests to look for, which containers will contain what we need. Jake felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and concern that always preceded a challenging operation. Sarah's intelligence work had been thorough and professional, but there was always the possibility that their information was incomplete or that the situation on the ground would be different from what they expected. The fact that they were operating without official authorization meant that they couldn't call for backup or support if things went wrong. Timeline? Jake asked. The facility receives shipments every Tuesday and Friday, Sarah replied. Cargo stays on site for processing and repackaging before being loaded onto outbound vessels. Our best window is Wednesday night, maximum cargo on site, minimum security presence, no scheduled arrivals or departures until Thursday morning. The operational plan was elegant in its simplicity. A small team would infiltrate the facility, locate and photograph the contents of specific containers, and withdraw without leaving any evidence of their presence. If Sarah's intelligence was correct, they would gather proof of weapons trafficking that could be used to shut down the operation permanently. If she was wrong, they would have committed multiple felonies for nothing. Equipment? Asked Lieutenant Chen. Sarah gestured toward a collection of bags and cases arranged along one wall of the warehouse. Night vision, communications gear, cameras, lockpicks, electronic surveillance equipment. Everything you need for a clean intelligence gathering operation. No weapons, no explosives, no equipment that couldn't be explained as commercial security consultation if you're caught. The absence of weapons was notable and deliberate. Sarah had made it clear from the beginning that their mission was intelligence gathering, not direct action. They were not going to war against the weapons trafficking network, they were gathering evidence that would allow others to take legal action against the criminals involved. Jake appreciated the restraint, but he also understood the risks. Operating without weapons meant that they would have no recourse if they encountered hostile security forces or if their mission was compromised. They would be dependent entirely on stealth, speed, and careful planning to avoid detection. What happens to the intelligence once we collect it? Asked Sergeant Reeves. Sarah's expression became more serious. That's where things get complicated. The evidence needs to reach people who can act on it, but it also needs to be delivered in a way that doesn't expose our involvement or compromise my identity. I have contacts in federal law enforcement who specialize in weapons trafficking, people who can use what we provide without asking too many questions about how it was obtained. The arrangement was clearly imperfect, but Jake understood that it was the best option available given the constraints they faced. The alternative was to allow the trafficking network to continue operating while American soldiers remained at risk from their own technology being used against them. Over the following days, Jake's team prepared for the Norfolk operation with the same intensity and attention to detail they brought to authorized missions. They studied the facility layout until they could navigate it blindfolded, practiced lockpicking and electronic surveillance techniques, and rehearsed their insertion and extraction procedures until every movement was automatic. Sarah proved to be an invaluable resource during their preparation, her years of intelligence work having given her insights into facility security and surveillance systems that complemented their tactical expertise. She had clearly spent considerable time studying their target, and her knowledge of the trafficking network's operational procedures allowed them to plan their mission with unprecedented precision. The night of the operation arrived with perfect conditions, overcast skies, minimal wind, and a new moon that provided maximum darkness for their approach. The Norfolk shipping facility sat on a peninsula jutting into the Chesapeake Bay, surrounded by water on three sides and accessible by land through a single heavily monitored entrance. Jake's team approached from the water side, using a small boat to reach the facility's pier without triggering any of the motion sensors that protected the main entrance. The infiltration proceeded exactly as planned. Lieutenant Chen defeated the electronic locks on the main warehouse door while Sergeant Reeves monitored security communications and Petty Officer Kim maintained overwatch from a concealed position near their extraction point. Jake followed Sarah into the facility, watching as she navigated directly to specific containers with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Container 774 Alpha, Sarah whispered into her radio as she examined a shipping manifest. Scheduled for departure tomorrow morning, destination listed as Lagos, Nigeria, but financial records show payment originated from an account in Syria. Inside the container, they found exactly what Sarah had predicted: sophisticated American military communications equipment, night vision systems, and targeting computers, all carefully packaged and labeled as commercial electronics. The serial numbers matched equipment that had been reported as surplus by various military bases, sold through supposedly legitimate channels to authorized dealers, and somehow diverted into the trafficking network. "This is millions of dollars worth of technology," Jake whispered as he photographed the container's contents. "Enough to equip several battalions with American-made systems." Sarah was already moving to the next container on her list, her efficiency suggesting years of practice at exactly this type of operation. "The network has been growing bolder as they've avoided detection. They're moving larger shipments, taking bigger risks, generating more profit." The second container contained body armor and helmet systems that were supposed to have been destroyed after reaching the end of their service life. Instead, they had been refurbished and prepared for shipment to buyers who would use them to protect fighters engaged in combat against American forces. The irony was both cruel and infuriating. They worked methodically through Sarah's target list, documenting shipment after shipment of American military technology that was being illegally diverted to hostile forces around the world. The scope of the operation was staggering, representing not just a criminal enterprise but a systematic betrayal of American military personnel who depended on technological superiority to survive in combat. As they prepared to withdraw from the facility, Sarah paused at one final container that wasn't on their original list. "This one's different," she said, studying the shipping manifest with unusual intensity. "The paperwork doesn't match the pattern I've been tracking." Inside, they found something that changed everything: advanced drone technology that was still classified, still in development, still restricted to the most sensitive military programs. The presence of such equipment in the trafficking network suggested that the corruption extended far beyond surplus sales and equipment diversions into active theft of classified military assets. "This is current-generation technology," Jake said, recognizing systems that his own unit had only recently been authorized to use. "Someone with very high-level access is feeding information to the network." Sarah's expression was grim as she photographed the drone components. "It's not just about money anymore. Someone is actively working to compromise American military capabilities by providing our most advanced technology to potential adversaries." The revelation transformed their intelligence-gathering mission into something much more urgent and dangerous. They were no longer just documenting criminal activity, they were exposing a security breach that could affect ongoing military operations around the world. The extraction from the facility proceeded without incident, but the boat ride back to shore was tense with the knowledge of what they had discovered. Jake's team had entered the warehouse expecting to find evidence of weapons trafficking. They were leaving with proof of active espionage that reached the highest levels of the American military establishment. As they reviewed their collected evidence in the abandoned warehouse that had become their base of operations, the magnitude of their discovery became clear. The trafficking network wasn't just selling surplus equipment to foreign buyers, they were operating a sophisticated espionage operation designed to compromise American military superiority by providing classified technology to potential adversaries. The question now, Sarah said as she prepared encrypted files containing their evidence, is whether the system that betrayed Shadow 7 can be trusted to act on this information, or whether we need to find another way to stop what we've discovered. Jake looked at his team, seeing in their faces the same determination that had driven them to risk their careers by joining Sarah's unauthorized operation. They had crossed too many lines to turn back now, but they had also uncovered a threat that was too serious to ignore. The mission that had begun with a chance encounter in a coffee shop had evolved into something that would test not only their skills as operators but their commitment to protecting their country from enemies both foreign and domestic. The woman they had once thought was just a small-town librarian had proven to be their guide into a world where the greatest threats to American security came not from external enemies but from the corruption and betrayal within their own ranks. As Sarah transmitted their evidence to contacts who could act on it without exposing their involvement, Jake realized that their work was far from over. They had struck a blow against the trafficking network, but the larger questions about corruption and betrayal within the military establishment remained unanswered. The fight that had begun in a warehouse in Prague 3 years ago was still being waged, and Sarah Martinez had finally found allies worthy of the truth she had carried alone for so long. The quiet librarian who stamped books and organized reading programs was gone forever, replaced by the leader of a shadow operation that would continue fighting until every American soldier could trust that their own technology would never be used against them. Jake Sullivan and his team had found their new mission, and they were ready to see it through to whatever end awaited them in the dangerous world between official duty and necessary action.